Then some Pharisees, Matthew 15, by the way, Matthew 15. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" Excuse me. They don't wash their hands before they eat. Now, before we get any further, there's two things we need to make clear that we're not talking about. We're not talking about sanitation. Okay, we're not talking about washing your hands because they're dirty. We're not talking about that. And we're not talking about like ceremonial washing according to God's actual law. We're talking about ceremonial washing according to these people's tradition and the various rules they had in place of how to rinse your hands before you ate anything. And even while you were eating, you were supposed to take breaks during your meals, between courses, really, and wash your hands in very specific ways, pointing up, pointing down, whatever. And nothing in the Old Testament says that you have to be that, fussy about washing your hands in a very particular way at particular times during the meal. So they're not talking about anything that God Himself ever actually said. And they're also not talking about sanitation. This is not referring, they're not interested in this case about washing your hands for sanitary reasons. They don't know a thing about that. So why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Jesus replied, "Why do you break the tradition of God for the sake of your tradition? The command of God for the sake of your tradition. For God said, honor your father and mother." That's one of the commandments. "And anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received," now we're talking about an adult person with an elderly parent. So that's, whatever help you might have received from me is a gift devoted to God, then he is not to honor his father with it. So basically they're saying that if you don't want to if you have an elderly parent that you're just tired of taking care of, and that can happen, you don't have to. You can take whatever you were going to give to your elderly parent and say you're going to dedicate that to God instead, and then you're excused from having to honor your parent. You're excused from having to take whatever you were going to provide for your elderly parent. You can then just offer that to God instead. So they were getting out of their obligation to take care of their parents. Again, we're talking about adult people with elderly parents. If you were still a child, you wouldn't be in a position to do this. So the person being condemned here is a person who is old enough to be in a position to honor their father and mother by giving them a gift, which means this is an adult and their parents are old and they're supposed to take care of their parents in their old age, but they're not doing that. They're not doing that, and they are getting out of it by, giving whatever they were going to give, or at least saying they're going to. They may not actually end up doing it. I don't know. If they're supposed to give something to their elderly parent, maybe in food of some kind, an animal to eat or something, they can say, well, I'm going to give that to God instead. Maybe they don't even end up doing it. So thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. You hypocrites! So they're adding traditions that are not honoring God. All these traditions they've been adding are not honoring God. They have completely lost sight of what it means to properly honor God. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. We see it in a footnote down here that goes back to Isaiah 29:13. So they're not honoring God. They have completely lost sight of what it means to properly honor God. Jesus called the crowds to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean. But what comes out of his mouth, that is what makes him unclean. Now this is an earth-shattering point that's going to really sock these Jews on their jaws when they hear it, because it's basically declaring that all foods are inherently clean. And a large portion of their law code is about what foods are not clean. In this context here in the book of Matthew, we're limiting it mainly to the idea that eating food with unwashed hands does not make you unclean. We are going to read in other Gospels, though, that when Jesus says this, he is essentially declaring all foods clean. And this is just going to explode these people's minds when they wrap their heads around it. In Mark 7, he goes into much more detail about this, and he does say in Mark 7, verse 20 or 19, actually, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now, Matthew has a dominant Jewish audience, and he's not quite willing to go that far. He's not quite willing to go so far as to say that Jesus is declaring all foods clean, because that would just, like I said, that would just explode these people's heads at the time. They're not even really going to get it until afterwards. Peter still sees a distinction between clean and unclean well into the life of the church. So this is one of those things where, looking back on it retrospectively, many years later, they will realize what Jesus was actually saying. We're going to read about Peter still, he has a vision about clean and unclean food in Acts 10, and gets the lesson from God saying that, don't call unclean whatever God has made clean. And we're going to read from Paul's letter in Galatians that even after that, years after Peter had that vision, which itself was years after the founding of the church, Peter still had a problem with with associating between clean and unclean. In this case, people, the clean Jews versus the unclean Gentiles. And that would have been 15, 20 years later even. So this is going to be a long-term issue for them, understanding that there really is no such thing as unclean. Matthew here in his gospel, written primarily to a Jewish audience, is not willing to go that far and say that. So in this context, we're referring to the unclean food, or what makes a man unclean, being eating food with unwashed hands. And the unwashing of the hands, or the washing of the hands, itself isn't even a proper godly command. It's one of these elders' made-up traditions that they've had over the years. So that's what, in Matthew, that's what the argument is about. Not following the proper elderly traditions to wash your hands, and so when you eat, you're eating unclean food because your hands are not clean. And he's just saying, well, that's bull. But the other Gospels, and they'll read about in Acts and the epistles later on, will go much farther with that, and to a degree that Matthew is not comfortable doing here in his Gospel. So what goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean, but what comes out of his mouth, that is what makes him unclean. Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this?" This would have been a big deal to a lot of them at that point in time. It's really hard for us to comprehend that because we haven't had that clean versus unclean distinction for thousands of years. I mean, that was separated in the first generation of the church. So we have spent 1900 plus years not even bothering with this, but they had spent 1500 years prior to this being taught the difference between clean and unclean and all that. And so it's hard for us to comprehend just how big of a deal this would have been to them. He replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides." So eventually, sooner or later, those who are not in the kingdom will be uprooted. And we read about that with the parable of the wheat and the tares. Eventually, the tares will be pulled up and tossed away and burned up in the fire. Eventually. It's not going to happen now, but eventually it will happen. So leave them. They are blind guides. If a blind man leads a blind man, both will fall into a pit. So they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what their self-inflicted blindness. They've had Jesus in front of them now for 3 years. They could have listened to him. They could have seen. They've seen the signs. They've literally seen the signs, and they've heard what he said. So they're not literally blind, and they're not literally deaf. They have seen the signs. They have heard the word, but they have shut their minds to it, and so they have made themselves blind. And so people who follow them are going to follow them into their own self-inflicted spiritual blindness. Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. "Don't you see that this would have been a really big deal. This would have been hard." And I just talked about how we read about in Galatians that even 15 or 20 years later, Peter was still struggling to grasp this clean and unclean issue because we've just been so rooted in it for so long. Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out into the toilet? But the things that come out of the mouth, so that's gone. It passes through the body and it's gone. The things that come out of the mouth, he's talking about, it's just a purely biological process. You put it into your mouth, your body does whatever it does with it. Either it comes out one end or it comes out the other if it's really bad for you, but it doesn't matter. It's just a biological process. It doesn't do anything to affect your spiritual condition. But the things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. And these make a person unclean. So that's what the uncleanness is really about. It's about spiritual purity. It's about holiness. The food you eat doesn't make you holy or unholy. But the things that you think about, which come out through the words you use and the actions you take, that's what makes you holy or unholy. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what make a man unclean. Eating with unwashed hands does not make him unclean. Again, there's a lot more to this. Matthew is keeping it relatively simple for his Jewish audience at this point. But we've read about in Mark and we read about in other places in the New Testament. There's a lot more to this than that. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. That's in the very northern end. This is actually where Phoenicia used to be. We've read about Tyre and Sidon before. David had an alliance with them back in the day. He secured the provisions from which to build the temple from them. Solomon used them to help build the temple. They were allies of Israel once upon a time, and they blessed Israel back in those days, in the days of David and Solomon. But they eventually turned on Israel, and they started cursing them. Jezebel was from Phoenicia, Tyre and Sidon. She was a daughter of the king of Phoenicia at that time, and she married Ahab, introduced Baal worship to Israel, and eventually Tyre and Sidon became enemies, and so Ezekiel and Jeremiah condemned them and prophesied their destruction, which finally happened. It happened in phases. Nebuchadnezzar tried to take Tyre, could not do so. In the 330s BC, however, Alexander the Great finally did. So the original city of Tyre isn't even there anymore at this point in time. Alexander the Great destroyed it and actually used its rubble to build a bridge out to the island city so he could destroy that. So this is where Jesus is going now. This is about as far north as he ever goes during his ministry. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out, look, this is definitely a Gentile. This is an unclean, impure person. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from demon possession. Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. His mission is not to go to the non-Israelite nations. Now, his disciples' mission will be. It's not as though Jesus does not want to help these people. It's just that his earthly mission was focused on the Israelite people in the Israelite nation. But he is going to Tyre and Sidon, so it's not like he doesn't care about those people either. And his apostles' mission will be to go everywhere. The woman knelt and came before him. Lord, help me, she said. By the way, she called him Son of David. That is a very Jewish term, of course. It means it's referring to the ruler who will come from the line of David to rule Israel and the entire world. And she called him that. So apparently she identifies him as the son of David, despite being a Canaanite woman living in Gentile territory, unclean territory. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs or their puppies. Yes, Lord, she said, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And then Jesus answered, Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Jesus left there, so he was testing her in some way, I suppose. I suppose that Jesus was always intending to heal this woman's daughter, but was putting her through a test. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. So the Tyre and Sidon are on the northern coast of Israel, where Phoenicia had been, and it's on the Mediterranean Sea. So he's walking away from there and going west again, or east, excuse me, along the Sea of Galilee. He's still in the northern regions. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. He's still in Gentile territory, by the way. Great crowds came to him, these are Gentile crowds. Okay, so this goes back to kind of what we were talking about, the clean and unclean. Okay, these would be the unclean people, and Jesus is hanging out with them now, because the Pharisees and the leaders in Jerusalem were out to get him. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Remember, these are not Israelites. This is a Gentile crowd. So they're praising the God of Israel for the work of this Israelite man. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. But his disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? Now, we had just gone through this not long before. This is a separate incident from the feeding of the 5,000, which you read about in the previous chapter. So we had just done this, and the apostles still don't get it. How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan. That is not the same feeding as the one recorded in the previous chapter. The details are different, the location is different, the crowds are different. This is a Gentile crowd, the previous one had been a Jewish crowd. Remember, Jesus is withdrawing from the Pharisees and teachers of the law area, so he's going to the Gentile regions to the north. And they will even make a distinction between these two things in an upcoming account in chapter 16. So Jesus has provided this bread. He has shown them that he can give them the bread. He can provide them the daily bread that they ask for. Now, he doesn't want them to be only focused on the bread. And we'll read about that again when we read the response to these provisions in the Gospel of John. The bread is not the most important thing. It is an important thing. And Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, your Heavenly Father knows that you need them. But your emphasis shouldn't be on the bread. Just like when he talks to the woman at the well in John chapter 4. And he talks about the living water, okay, the living bread and the living water, and she wants this water so she can never go thirsty again. And she misses the point initially. Now, she gets it later on, but this is the point initially, that the water itself is not the big deal. It's not that it's unimportant, because you need water to survive. You need that even more, you need bread. But the living water Jesus is talking about isn't about just an endless fountain of water you can drink from. And the living bread that Jesus is talking about, and that he has promised to provide, is not all about just the physical bread that you put in your mouth and eat. And these are the lessons that he's trying to teach them at this point in time. And it's hard. Even the disciples, the ones who are with him all the time, are having a hard time getting it. And they won't really get it until afterwards. It'll make sense to them later. But even in the midst of it, even with him right there teaching them directly, it's going to be hard. It's not really going to get all the way through.